All right, so we're here today with Christina Roberts. Thank you so much for joining me. We were just chatting beforehand that we met at the Outspoken Summit in 2019. So very cool to reconnect. And I really appreciate you being willing to be a part of this conversation. You had a chance to listen to the interview that I did with the other three on this topic and reached out about being part of the conversation. And that's super cool. That was one of my goals, is that people will want to reach out and be a part of this conversation. So really great. Christina, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and why it's important for you to be a part of this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. My name's Christina Roberts. I've been in sport in some capacity for, over 20 years. My journey started in the yoga space. I've been an instructor for roughly 20 years as well. So my own, journey took me to many different places, working with a lot of different people. And after I had my first child at the age of 30, I really felt disconnected to my body and needed movement in some regard. And that came by way of running. It was challenging in the beginning. And at some point, a switch flipped, and it felt great to reconnect with myself and to spend time either with friends or being outside by myself. And as I grew to really love the sport, I signed up for races, eventually onboarded with a coach, and 5Ks turned into 10Ks to halves to fulls. And eventually I ran a couple of ultra marathons within the past couple of years. But it wasn't until 2016 that my first introduction to triathlon was spectating Ironman Lake Placid. It was the craziest spectating experience I ever participated in. 2 naps, lots of running around, cheering, incredibly overwhelmed and honored to be a part of that community. And I felt that I needed some level of connection. I needed more than just what I was getting out of running. My coach at the time then started incorporating some cross training of swimming and biking that eventually turned me towards competing in my first sprint triathlon in 2017. And a couple of triathlons, a couple of halves later, I'm now preparing for Ironman Mont Tremblant in less than 2 weeks.
So exciting. Woo-hoo.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Very fun. Now, tell us about yourself professionally, because you have some really, great things to contribute to this conversation because of where you're at professionally. Let's talk about that a bit.
Sure. So in my day job, I work for a healthcare organization. I've been there for 23 years. I worked in healthcare technology for about 18 and shifted into strategic operations, actually as of this past February. And in addition to that, I'm a triathlon and endurance coach. And I'm also a mental skills coach. So in 2018, I really leaned into sports psychology. I onboarded with my own sports psychologist to help me work through some race anxiety. And I thought there was such a world worth of help out there for, athletes such as myself and in the professional world, that I wanted to be a part of that. I went back to school in 2019, and I recently graduated with my master's in sports psychology. So I'm actively doing mental skills coaching with a number of athletes in different sports.
That's super cool. And we were talking earlier about how I have such a respect and I think it's such a cool thing to have interest in the sports psychology side of things. I have deep history there. I worked with a sports psychologist, Dr. Hap Davis, from age of 9 years old till I was 26. And he played such a huge role in my development as an athlete and as a human being as well. I mean, those are all my, my developmental years. And And then also, I think, is why I have a passion for this kind of stuff. He successfully helped me, know exactly what to do when I moved from different sports and, from equestrian show jumping into triathlon and then Ironman racing professionally, and then out of that into some more hobby sports as I retired from professional racing. And he just played such a huge role in my life. I feel like he gave me the tools and the foundation from through all those years, and it allowed me to have that kind of insight along with the other things that I talked about on the last interview. So I really, I love that you have that passion and that you went back to school for that. And so not only are you an athlete yourself, but, have so much to contribute as far as the education side of things. Now, anyone who's watched the first interview, and hopefully they have, or if you haven't, go ahead and back and watch it. This whole conversation, and my goal with these conversations, gathering as many interviews as possible, is we want to create awareness and eventually tools and programs to help get in front of athletes. And I think there's, professional athletes and elite athletes, but also like we were talking about, is any athletes that are going through changes and transitions and chapters in their development and athletic career. So, we really honed in on the changing of chapters and transition for professional athletes in the last interview. But I think there is something to be said for all kinds of athletes and just human beings that are going through changes and chapters in their lives. And the real goal is creating space for these kinds of conversations and awareness for people, presenting some different ideas ahead of time, gathering as much research and as we can, and then hopefully collectively over time as a group we can provide tools that get in front of these problems. And we know there's a lot of resources and there's a lot out there for once people have issues that they're dealing with. Maybe they've struggled with some issues for a number of years or a period of time, and then they get to a place in their life where they seek out help. My goal is to get in front of that this stuff is out there already and presented as an option for people, and that awareness allows them to make these changes and chapters in their life much more successfully and smoothly. So the very first topic that we want to dive into, and I started the conversation with the other group with this, is the question I have is, are we born differently? Right? So this group of people, is it genetics? Is it socially, environmentally? All of these factors that come into play. But just in general, are we actually born differently? And the feedback I've gotten from a number of athletes and people that have reached out since that first interview, there's so many people that can relate. They're like, yes, this is how I feel. This is how I feel. We all speak the same language. And so, and I shared the experience I have with sport animals, racing dogs, sport horses, those kinds of things. So, I'd really like your insight on that first part of this topic. Does the awareness for people to make these transitions successfully in their lives start with understanding this question? Are we actually born differently?
It's such an interesting question, because in one way I could say absolutely, but in the next I could say, well, but also there are so many other factors that I think need to be considered. Because there are, stories of, and we'll just use, athletics as an example. A great athlete today might not have been a great athlete as a child. And, so but there could be some foundational characteristics that maybe started to be discoverable at an early age, like, perhaps dedication, some of that intrinsic motivation, competitiveness, whatever some of those, key characteristics are, just started popping up at a young age that were supported by the environment in which they were in. So I think there's something to be said for, the people with whom you surround yourself. And as a kid, you don't have much choice in that. But if that group is going to, highlight, celebrate, support those great characteristics, that individual might be more apt to let those shine through, to feel more comfortable, in that space, fully expressing themselves, by way of sport in this regard, to be a high performer. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said, like we talked about in our last conversation, that the athletes that have the ability to see it through, when I used to, see it through right to the elite level or professional level, there has to be something different about that as well, because, I used to coach show jumping, and I worked with kids from, the age of 9 years old all the way up through their teenage years, and then all the way up to where they became elite when they're a little bit older. And you see it in all kinds of sports, with kids sports, right? There's not a whole lot of kids that actually go through those phases and the next steps and stick with primarily, like Juan was talking about, from when he was 9 years old, it was just basketball, basketball, basketball. Leanda said a lot of very similar things. I was very similar in the life choices that I started making, whereas a lot of kids, when they hit their teenage years, they start to get, involved in a lot more, different areas, and they maybe let it go to the wayside, or, kind of move away from it. So, I think, yes, nurtured and environment, that's one part of the conversation for sure. But there has to be something different about the people that see it through from childhood right through adult life. Have you have any experience or thoughts on that?
That's a great point too. And I think, just to add on around, once they get to a certain age and kind of get into other things, there's also a reliance that I think the collective, we have on coaches at the adolescent level. And so the goal within coaching in let's say for team sports, needs to shift a little bit to support the adolescent. And there are, numerous changes that are happening, socially, physically, things at home, that sport can become a safe haven for them. But if the coaching environment is not supportive of that and doesn't help them, really progress within that level to want to even see that far ahead, it's going to become a challenge. And there are a lot of adolescents that wind up quitting sport. I think it's girls around, age 11. I'd have to go back and, check my facts, but, there's a lot of dropout. Kids aren't even making it towards, the latter years of high school or even into college for that to be a possibility. But I also agree with your point around, just that whole continuum of sport. There's a dedication, a devotion, that needs to come from the athlete first, before it's really realized by, their circles of support that keeps them going. And I think there's even a time where you, as the athlete, if you are so self-aware and that is your path, you're going to be able to kind of quiet a naysayer, or perhaps not take the advice of, another individual, because it's just not right for you in the healthiest way. So I think there's just a shift between those two particular groups, depending on what age they're at.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? I know from my own experience, like I said, my first major sport, I did like little track and field and gymnastics and all those fun little things as you're a kid. But my first major sport was show jumping, and I did that from 9 to 26. And as a young person, I was making very adult decisions, and they were decisions like I moved from the small town that I lived in to a city 3 hours away to finish out. I applied to a high performance self-study program school, and moved away from home, and everything was very much like the conversation Juan was having, was 24/7 dedication to that sport, working with a sports psychologist. I was wrapping my career around that. I wasn't even interested in anything else. That was getting to the Grand Prix level, and then eventually becoming a horse trainer myself, and a coach and running a stable and all that, and to be making those kinds of decisions at, I don't remember how, I was 15 years old, and
it's
and
intense.
just was able to put the things in place to make it happen. Of course I had the support system as well. I had, great riding stable and trainer myself, and then I had, parents that they thought I was crazy, but they they supported me, and so there's those, but another 15-year-old might still just be busy going to, grade 10 parties and
Right.
thinking about their driver's license. And so I can share that story about myself, but I'm not alone in that. There are, every single elite athlete or professional athlete or Olympian has a very, very similar story. Their whole life was dedicated towards that sport. And
Yes.
I think there must be something about people that have the ability to do that is just a little bit different than, someone else. It's a different, I don't know if it's mental or if it's physical or if it's emotional or what it is, but that's the part that I really like to talk about with other peers to find out what that is.
There has to be that level of focus, or you're never going to get there. So, and while, you can have an Olympian as an example, kind of unravel once they're there, that's a different story. But seeing, where I am now and where I want to go, that is incredible focus. And I think while the percentage of people in the grand scheme of people is very small, the intensity is incredibly high, and every little decision matters and impacts your ability to perform at that really high level. So it has to be tight.
Right. Yeah. And I think the other part of the conversation with the environmental is how many of the athletes that have the ability to do this come from, we talk about the supportive side of things and having that kind of network and support, whether it be coaches or family life, but how many of them actually come from situations that are perhaps teaching them the skills to be very tolerable and are negative environments. Abuse, there's a lot of studies out there where there is a high relationship between people with who have suffered some kind of trauma or abuse and their connection to elite athletics as well. So when we look at were they born differently from a genetic standpoint of view, but then also if they're in an environment, say you've got two siblings in one household and there's a high level of trauma and abuse, and one takes the direction of maybe, a lot of poor decisions that lead their life in a really negative direction, and the other one chooses sports and goes in that direction. So there has to be is there a relationship between those types of things that you've seen?
I think, and we talked a little bit about this beforehand, but there is this, there's an inherent need to self-soothe. And so when, while I'm not an expert in trauma, there is the need to cool the trauma. And that is in some way that feels helpful to the individual, but helpful doesn't always mean healthy. So helpful could be alcohol, drugs, destructive behaviors. Helpful could also be, I'm going to go for a run, or I'm going to journal, or I'm going to move away. I'm going to detach myself from my environment, or I'm going to get into this one thing. And maybe that one thing is sport. And that becomes, at least maybe initially, the outlet. And depending on, in my experience, the individual, the outlet can be a place of escape, or it can be a place of development and kind of just leveling up yourself. So just general self-development. And I think then you could have two different paths off of that individual that chooses, I'm going to self-soothe with sport.
Right. And then that kind of moves us on to the next block of this conversation, is that then once you've made those choices and whatever your motivations are to get into that, you spend such a huge part of your life being highly trained and refined in a certain way. So now you're also in an environment for good, and but we can openly talk about the good and bads of it, right? There is, you're given an enormous tool set, opportunities, you're developed in a really positive and healthy way. You know, you're taught to, you know, be very goal driven. There's all of these things, but there's also the side of it that we talked about from the last interview, where it can be very isolating. You miss out on a lot of what would be considered normal developmental life experiences, especially if you go through sport through your childhood and teenage years and then adult years. I think it's different when people transition out of, you know, to the next chapter of their life, when if it ends at, let's say, college age, versus I've seen athletes who make that transition where they've also spent not only their childhood, their teenage years, but then also their primary adult years in those kinds of environments. And so you're very, very highly trained a certain way. You know, you're taught skills that are, some of them are very positive, and then some of them, when we move to this next chapter, can be an actual anchor point that becomes a struggle, right? And one of them might be the ability to ask for help, or not have that stoic, you know, stance about yourself that, hey, I don't understand what's actually wrong with me, but I'm not going to say anything. And then maybe your support system and your family and all that don't really know what to do, and you don't know how to express yourself. And so, you know, I think because you're in sports psychology, and sports psychology is an area where you are part of helping athletes learn and train them to be highly focused and not deter away from their performance whatsoever. What, from your opinion, would be that the parts of it, because that's necessary for a high level of performance. So you can't, we talked about that too, is you can't deviate away from that too early, because it might interrupt the success of the athlete. However, at what point is there, you know, as people start to transition, where we say, okay, these skills were there and they're learned, and now they're highly trained, and now we need to interject these skills to help them on their way out?
Yeah. So I love how you shared about your sports psychology experience. I think that is outstanding. You had that much time to really build on and build upon it, a really great foundation. And you mentioned it wasn't just things that helped you in sport, it helped you in life. And through my studies as well, we were always, you know, kind of reminded, while our door into, you know, the mind of the athlete is through sport, what we are, you know, trying to help raise awareness to, and what we're trying to help build skill sets, you know, with them, is to help all areas of their life. So we're getting in the door through sport, but it's really, you know, kind of a all the way around 360 self-serving type of endeavor. So the skills, you know, that I honestly enjoy, you know, helping athletes develop is a little bit of just general goal setting with a lot more depth. So goals that are purely focused on an external, motivator, like a time or a particular pace. Those are great to have. And I know that, you know, with a professional athlete, it is important and a must-have to have. But then creating depth within, you know, those particular goals that are sprinkled throughout, you know, the training, that are focused more on process. So, you know, just digging into a little bit more detail around how can you get to this number? But then also building a side goal, you know, goal A, goal B, goal C. What are some other goals that for you as a person can be satisfactory and or comforting if you don't hit that A goal? Also understanding the A goal is detrimental to, you know, career and, you know, sponsorship, et cetera. But just having a once and done thing can be, you know, catastrophic to the athlete's well-being. And, oh, go ahead.
No, it's all right. Yeah.
And then through the process, so it's great to have a goal, but it's, in my opinion, better to be continuously reflecting upon what is your progress over, you know, the course of time to get to your goal. So, you know, for some athletes, it might seem very daunting and exhausting to take time and reflect on a really hard training session, or a week's worth of, incredible workouts or a race. But I think it's important to take a little bit of that time, because it is money in the bank moving forward to help you build your competencies towards, that goal that you're really working towards. So I love the reflection, and it will, I think, help also reduce some of that performance anxiety that can start to creep up once that taper begins. So that's also a really great thing to focus on.
Yeah, I really like what you said there about how when a person's in the chapter of their life where they are being highly trained and highly focused on their performance, you're focusing on, yes, developing their goal setting and their ability to perform at a high level, but you also add the element of, goal setting and tools on their life. I think as they move out of that chapter of their life into regular life, the thing that I talked about and I think is really important is maintaining the routine. So now it flip-flops, right? Yeah. Now it becomes about life and using sport as part of their program for life. So in the actual meat and potatoes of someone's athletic, high athletic and their career, it is all about, yes, how is their life, but it's all about that performance and that result, right? And that is what they're trained to do. You're trying to win. You need to win. Yes. To make a living. And as a psychologist, you're looking at it going, well, let's make sure that we continue to sprinkle in the life skills that you're going to be able to use once you're, they don't realize that, but it's like, let's just keep checking in on your life, keep checking in on it, right? And then yes. I think what's really key about what you said there, and I think that can be helpful in this whole process, is that you can take that recipe and just flip-flop it, which is what we see for most older athletes, right? That and success, people who have changed those chapters successfully, and and people who get into sport later, it's that they realize, okay, like you had said, the progress, having these challenges in our life and having this community and all of those things, now we can just say, okay, it's okay to stay. What are the pieces of that sport that you need to stay connected to as you go into your normal life? Because some athletes, they don't want anything to do with the sport that they were doing once they retire. So just saying to them, let's go ahead and do this on an amateur level now, or let's just do this for fun. They don't have the ability to do that. I had to take 5 years off completely. I didn't touch a bike for 5 years. Juan talks about, like, there's no way he would go play basketball. And, Jacob said the same thing. He was like, I do not want to go, shoot hoops. That's like the last thing they want to do. And so, but what parts of that are important to integrate into the program and into the tools where those two parts flip-flop a little bit. And then we have to talk about too, how much of this is there an actual, as someone's transitioning in those chapters, on like, is there set standards on mental health screening? Like, are we ignoring that there might have been some trauma as a child in their childhood that drove them through this path, and through their success that got forgotten? Is there genetically predisposed parts of their life to anxiety, depression, addiction, these kinds of things that run deep in their family history and in their genetics, that because they were successful and they were an athlete, that they got forgotten as well? And so now, as we transition out of this, is there a screening process that could happen for athletes to revisit that, to make sure that, and how much of what they're going to go through is from there, or based on something that might have happened to them while they were in their athletic career? Concussions are a huge one. We talked about that, right? Is many little concussions over a long period of time misdiagnosed as depression and anxiety, and actually it's traumatic brain injury stuff going on. We've all heard stories of that. Is that being screened, recognized, and part of this changing of chapters? Are those tools there for them? Because they might have been there, we might have had all this childhood trauma, then they become a successful athlete, they're highly trained in this environment, they're given all their identity becomes wrapped around it, every tool becomes developed and really highlighted in this environment, and then we're just meant to go back into the real world, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, let's talk about that.
There's so much there. It like the visual I have in my head is the world is spinning at such a rapid rate for them. And once this transition, this new chapter happens, it almost seems to stop. And there is this, I've referred to some of my athletes regarding this. It almost feels like an emotional whiplash. One day you are, a dialed in, heavily competing athlete, and the next it feels like it's all gone. And you're kind of left in this emotionally bankrupt state, not knowing which direction to go, at least with some athletes. And I think I know there is an absolute shortage of any sort of mental health access, at least in the United States for sure. And there's still continues to be this stigma around asking for help, utilizing resources. I think it's softening, but there's still a lot more work to do. Individuals like, Simone Biles being outspoken about, some of her challenges, and Michael Phelps and other athletes who are really being, vocal about their own challenges. And what we do have to help support in any way possible is helping. But I think having discussions like this can also be another avenue to really highlight the importance of it. I think one of the biggest maybe things to consider is the athletes being then disconnected from their teams, their sponsors, and maybe not then having the opportunity or the access for some of those regular check-ins. And to my knowledge, there isn't any sort of a regular screening other than maybe your primary care provider asking you if, you have any, depressive thoughts. There's a little mental health screening. In my experience, it's just been a really quick, I'm going to ask these really uncomfortable questions. I'm going to get the yes, no's. I'm going to check in my computer, and yeah, it looks like you're okay. So we'll move on.
Right. And then it's how much of that is like being, treated through, they're just slapping medication on it, or, like now is psychedelics and things like that. That is probably for this group of people, maybe some of that's the answer, and maybe that saved a lot of problems in life, but maybe for some that's absolutely the wrong answer. And really just making sure that, the awareness and the tools ahead of time are in place would avoid a lot of that. I know, like for me, and conversations I've had with a lot of peers, is there is that, you're engulfed in this environment for an extended period of time where exactly that, all of your friends and your relationships are with this group of people. So for example, I was part of like training groups or training camps at very specific locations with people for years at a time. You live with them, you train with them, you become best friends with them, you travel with them. These are relationships that are so much deeper than normal friendships, because you're with, you're going through really hard things with them. You share a common interest, you're pressing really hard for something, you're traveling together, you're living together. I mean, other than going to college and living with your college roommates, I don't think that there's any case where adults would be living, 5 people in one house in a strange country, all just eat, sleep, train together and compete together, right? And that's a common thing with teams. And you look at hockey teams, football teams, bike teams, and then when you retire, you figure out, okay, well, where am I going to live now? And if you, all of those people you became very, very close to are scattered all over the world. And so now all your friendships and relationships that were extremely tight, some of them survive, but a lot of them, as life moves on and gets busy, are, something that is in your past. And that can be a pretty difficult part of the transition as well, as you have to establish an entire new network socially, and you figure out that you're only the same as all the people that you were with all the time.
Right.
And now you're socially trying to integrate yourself back into an environment where you are not the same as everybody else. Your experiences are not the same. Your language is not the same. The way you go about your life is not the same. And I think that piece of it, where we talked about this a little in the last interview, is that where the people that you end up being surrounded by, your support network and your environment and the place that you choose to live becomes a huge, huge part of this changing of chapters, because that piece is ripped out from underneath you, just like, and that part can be very, very hard, very hard.
Yeah. And I think too, depending on your experience in sport, trying to find some common thread back to it, whether, you get into coaching or, you try and compete at an amateur or a participant level, I should say, which is super challenging for them. Absolutely. That could be traumatic in itself to, reconnect with what you've most recently left and feel conflicting. Wait, did I leave? Should I have left? Like, should I have stayed? Could I have done things differently? And sometimes you might ruminate over the things that never were, which can send you down, a different rabbit hole as well.
And the constant comparison, there's sure. So many, triathletes that I train with now, as they're a little closer to their transition out of being a professional, and they're still stuck at comparing to what they were before. And that can be very, very frustrating for them. And I see that actually even just in aging athletes, because obviously being a coach for a long time, as athletes age and they get stuck in this comparison to their old self, it's a vicious cycle for them, and it can be really, really emotionally hard as well, because everything that you did was at its very, very best. So for some athletes, going to something completely different where they learn something new and they do see progress and they're completely unattached from what they did before, yes. They never have to think about that again, is the right decision, and maybe for a little while. So maybe establishing what that will be, whether it be in music or arts or another sport, or might be in academics, but something that is put in place for a person as they come out, and recognizing, like, what is that? What's the routine? What's the environment? What's your social connection going to be? How is that going to nurture all of these things right back to that starting point of what, how were you as a kid? What happened to you? How did you get into this? What was the time period that you were in the sport? What was your environment in that sport? And then that's going to help you establish how you should come out of it. I think all those pieces are such a huge part of it.
And actually, you mentioning, the aging athlete, that's why I believe that setting up some of those process goals and doing that reflection is very helpful. At some point, I know this is, kind of, dirty to say, but we're not going to get any faster. At some point, we're just not going to get any faster.
That's well and truly behind me.
We're actually going to get slower. It's so terrible to say, but we're actually going to get slower. But our experience with how we're getting slower could be better than our experience when we were faster. And I think sprinkling in, some of those process goals can help soften, well, I wanted to do this time, but I actually had a better experience because I was able to look around and, I thanked a volunteer or whatever it is. So you can, honestly build yourself in a different way when you're physically on the decline.
Yeah. And I think recognizing those things about ourselves that are different, that we are maybe our characteristics as a human being are a little different. I talked about the importance of having routine and structure, and, the things that are closely tied to what your body and your brain has been used to for a number of years, because to suddenly and drastically change that on someone who is highly focused, I think can be traumatic as well. So I think, understanding that and having that in place is a really important part of it. Just knowing, as simple as you figure things out, you're going to wake up at the same time every day. You're going to still get a little endorphins every day. You're still, those kinds of things. I think that's such I mentioned that before. It's just such a huge piece of it that is so easily overlooked.
It is. Yeah, I agree with, absolutely sleep and absolutely finding a routine that definitely works, because that's going to be one of your foundational pieces as you continue to, kind of move through your next chapters. And remembering that all things take a little bit of time. It's so hard to be patient, but just reminding, yourself as the athlete, I need to be patient with this. You're not going to build for your A race in 2 weeks. Your training is going to take a really long time. You're not going to be performing at, the highest of levels in a couple of months. It's going to take a lot of time. So knowing that on the tail end of, shifting into a new chapter, it's going to take a little bit of time to get used to that newness, trying to find ways in which you can maybe mentally downshift and accept where you are, can be helpful.
Yeah, and also there's an element of acceptance as far as once you've been through all of that, you're not only were you maybe born a different way, but you're never going to be quite the same. There's a lot of coaches talk about the difference between professionals and the difference between amateurs, the amount of aerobic load that they're able to tolerate and handle and absorb over an extended period of time. And it changes them physiologically on a level that allows them to race or compete at a higher level. If you're talking about strength sports, maybe those athletes are able to get much greater size than an average person. The work rate that they're able to put in for a long period of time and cope with their joints, their muscle tissue, everything is just, it's developed differently. And so after that is all there, it's not going to just suddenly go away. And so the acceptance and a community of acceptance that understands, and even just the tools given to people's family members and peers, and even just the knowledge of that yourself as an athlete, that, hey, my capacity for what's normal to me is possibly going to look different than what society tells me is normal. And we can avoid that internal battle as well. Because like I had mentioned before, a normal, almost 46 years old, a normal 46-year-old female might, at a healthy level, go to the gym 5 days a week, do some kind of cardio, some kind of strength training, some kind of stretching, and have some hobbies and that's very, very healthy. And that might be what society will, conversation-wise, pressure you into thinking is what you need to do to be normal. And that can become a mental and emotional battle. When you're normal, like for me, I had mentioned before that a normal week can be anywhere between 13 and 20 hours of exercising a week. And that's my normal. And anyone else would be like, I don't get that.
Right. That's insane. Why would, right.
For me, I used to train, 30 to 35 hours a week in and week out, year round, and compete all year round, all over the world in, several Ironmans, half Ironmans. So for me, that is a massive reduction and a massive shift in, and obviously my focus and intensity on those sessions and socially how I approach them and all of that is completely different than when I was trying to race and train.
But also still really high, but now it's your new normal.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a level of acceptance, not only on the front end that, hey, are these markers make us different so that we're able to take this path? Then as we transition out, are these things, after we've been through all of that, are we now different? And there needs to be an understanding and acceptance and a clear path how to manage that. And I mentioned before, I think it's not only in our world in athletics that this is an issue, but it's, first responders, military, and as simple as sport animals, they just have a complete understanding that this is part of the process, and there are tools in place for these exit strategies. Even you see it in high level CEO positions, those kinds of things. As people retire, they're given very clear exit strategies into their retirement. So
yeah, absolutely. That's so fascinating.
Yeah. So I love this conversation, and I feel like if you were going to, from your expertise, give three, and I know I'm just like throwing this on you, so I'll even give you a second to think about it, but if you're going to give, based on these three very clear, chapters, front end, middle, transition, what would be the three main things that you would hit to say, these are the things we need to focus on to develop some tools for these changes of chapters?
I love that. So I think tools, I'm going to go back to your word of routine and call that a tool.
Yeah.
I think that, and while the routine looks different in those three different chapters, and even in the in-betweens, routine is a foundation, I believe, that keeps us grounded and gets us off on literally and figuratively the right foot every day. So once you have that established in the healthiest way, you can be a little bit more self-aware of how you as the individual act, behave, respond when the routine is off. So if you don't get as much sleep, or you know, wound up, I don't know, just going ham at McDonald's, or you didn't get your, you know, a recovery workout in, whatever it was, like you have an opportunity to get to know you and what makes you function at your best mentally and physically. I think routine is incredibly important.
Yeah, I love that. And, you know, when you were saying that, the one thing that made me think back to when I was working with my sports psychologist, we had many, many years of documentation and tracking of our visualization process before we went into the show jumping ring. And we knew there was a state where we competed the best, and we did many hours and so much recording and training, small competitions, large competitions, on emotions that we felt. We kept this little, you know, circle these graphs, and there became a very clear pattern that each person had where they were able to focus, visualize, and compete the best.
Yes.
And then before we would compete, we were asked to visualize, feeling and seeing through breath work every moment of what we were about to do. And if at any point we, you know, that was interrupted, then you were brought back to that through breath and how you felt. And you know, and then by the time you went out to compete in the show jumping ring, where everything was very fast and off reactionary, you'd already been there before. So where I'm going with that is that you're saying this routine is sort of an idea of that. It's your routine. And when you are in your best routine, if you start to track a log of how you feel emotionally and, you know, just in general, what your life looks like. And what you said that was so key is the moment you start to feel differently than that, you would recognize it quicker.
Yes.
Because it was the same thing. We would recognize when our visualization process was interrupted through breath and our thoughts. And until we could get through that whole visualization, an exact same breathing pattern, feeling it and seeing it and sticking to that emotion that we knew we competed best, we had to keep doing that until you could. And then boom, you went out in the ring and you performed, and your performances became so consistent on a very successful level. You knew exactly where you needed to be to go and win. And so I think that tracking that based on the routine, you're going to be able to develop the insight and tools of knowing, hey, I'm starting to go off track a little bit here. How do I need to pull it back so that I don't get myself into trouble?
And to take your, you know, comment a little bit further, in, you know, endurance events, for sure, you know, you're out there for a really long time. When you start to feel that there's something not right, you now have the opportunity to make a decision. Okay, how can I get myself back on track? I'm aware that I'm not feeling my best right now. And you can identify a little bit better. Is this a nutrition issue? Am I saying negative things to myself? Do I need to kind of reframe my language? You know, what am I, you know, dehydrated? What is my, what's my current state, and how can I get back to ideal state?
Right. Yeah, that's super cool. I know I said three things, but I think we just stick with that one main thing, because
I
that's
do
like
too.
really, really cool. That's really awesome. Christina, any closing thoughts? I've loved this conversation. I think we've both been able to contribute some more really helpful things for people to hear. If everyone listening to these only takes one thing away that they can apply to their life or pass on to someone else to make their life better, athletics better for them, changes the chapters in their life, we can help, you know, not only help athletes who are transitioning in different, you know, stages and chapters of their career, but I think just people in general, you know, as they walk through life, like you said, you know, with having a baby and then changing in chapters of your life. So I think, you know, really cool stuff. I think if everyone maybe even just takes away one good thing, we've you know, made a difference, and that's the most important thing to me.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much. This was so great. I know we could keep talking for hours.
I know. All right. Well, any very last little golden nugget that you would like to say?
You actually said it when you were talking about, your experience with visualization, and that's such a powerful tool that actually does imprint an experience in your mind. So being able to visualize a positive experience and drawing in different aspects, whether it's, smells, scents, sounds, feelings, as you continue to replay that in your mind, it becomes like a and I've already done this before event for you when you go to do the real thing. And then to your point, you're able to bring yourself back to, this is my ideal state. And over the course of time, learn I can perform at my best when I'm in this particular state. And that's key.
Super cool. Love it. Thank you so much for your time and
Thank
your
you.
thoughts and everything. Really, really appreciate it. And we'll, if people wanted to reach out to you or find you, where can people find you?
Oh, sure. Great question. Can you put my email address in your post?
Yes,
Yep.
I will, for sure.
Email would be great. And I can send you my Instagram handles and my website.
Awesome. And anyone obviously who's following along with me, you can find everything with me at mcc.coach. Reach out anytime. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic and any other questions you might have. All right. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.